Coming up on today's program, I'll be checking in with one of the co-founders of the Ottawa Canadian Film Festival, Jith Paul. But before that, I'll be speaking with two filmmakers whose works will be featured in the festival, Kris Fleerackers and Andrea Wing. Good morning, Kris, and welcome to Luta Contunua.
Good morning.
Kris, let's start off by you telling us a little bit about your film Idol that's going to be in the festival tonight, actually.
It's a strange little film because it doesn't have any live actors. It's live action, but the actors are puppets that are about maybe just under a foot tall, maybe a little bit less. And they're flat. They're two-dimensional, but they move in a three-dimensional space. They're a little bit articulated, so they have parts that can move. And I animated them live in front of the camera inside a cardboard set, like a set made from recycled cardboard with tiny little objects that I created and little pieces of furniture and all that kind of stuff. And the story is based on a poem by a Roman poet from 2,000 years ago named Ovidius, or Ovid. He wrote a very long poem in two books, or several books, that contained sort of all the mythical stories that circulated in his days. And one of those stories was Pygmalion. It's a story of a man who falls in love with a sculpture of a woman that he's created himself. He's a man who's kind of fallen out of love with women and is disappointed with women around him, the real women. So he lives a bachelor life and he creates a fake woman for himself, and then he falls in love with it. And in the original story, he becomes quite desperate because, of course, she's a statue, she's an object made of ivory, and she can't reciprocate. So he grows frustrated. He tries to treat her like a real person, which doesn't work. And then he prays to the goddess of love, Aphrodite, or Venus in the Roman world. And she grants that his sculpture comes to life. And then in the original story, at that moment, she recognizes him, and she sees him for the first time. She opens her eyes, and 9 months later, they have a baby, which I thought was kind of problematic. So I gave it a twist, which I won't give away. But the story follows that quite directly, only I contemporize it. So I sort of set it in vaguely modern times. And it's a story without words. I used music by Jean-Philippe Rameau because he wrote an opera about Pygmalion. And there's one aria that I absolutely love that I originally saw in a film or heard in a film by Carlos Saura, Spanish filmmaker, when I was in university. And that aria always stuck with me, and that was a starting point. But that's in a nutshell what it's about.
I think that says quite a bit. It's a very interesting film and a very beautiful film, Kris. And
Thank
joining us right now is our other filmmaker, Andrea Winger. Or is it, it's interesting, Andrea, I had your name as Wing. So is it Andrea?
It is Wing. Yeah. Everyone calls me Winger, so feel free. And sorry for being late. I just jumped out of a meeting.
No worries. Where are you joining us from?
I am joining you from Whistler, British Columbia. I live in Squamish, just about 45 minutes south of here, in between Vancouver and Whistler. But this is an office I work out of.
Well, Andrea, we're happy to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So you have two films in the festival, one which played yesterday, which is Leo and Chester, and one that's playing tonight called The Trapline. I'd like to hear about both those films, but seeing as audiences will get a chance to see Trapline tonight, tell us about that film.
Yeah, The Trapline is a film I shot up in the Yukon about my friend Sid, and she is a trapper and really took over the trapline from an old timer up in the Yukon by the name of Jurg. And I thought she had a super interesting and compelling story and very unusual life. She's a geologist by trade and then runs a trapline throughout the winter. And it took me forever to convince her that making a film was a good idea because she's very reclusive and she's like, no, there's nothing special about my life. And so finally she agreed, and I really just, the way that she approaches trapping, I know that's a polarizing topic, but the way that she carries it out and manages her concession or trapline is a really interesting, I think, experience and I think will be an interesting experience for the viewers as well. She took over the Trapline from an old timer, and he was really keen to pass it down to somebody who he knew would take care of the line, and he had invested about 30 years of his life doing the same thing. And so it's a story about their friendship and her making a go of the line herself.
Thank you for that, Andrea. So seeing as we've got two very different films here, I'm going to do my best to sort of toggle between the two projects. So Kris, going back to you, why do you think that this play that was written 2,000 years ago is relevant today?
Well, it was a poem, actually. It wasn't a play. It's part of a really long poem. Well, I think.
So can I just ask you a quick question, Kris? Was the poem made into a play, Pygmalion? I guess because maybe that's where I'm getting.
Yeah, no, it's been recycled over and over the last 2,000 years. I think it seems to have rung a bell sort of with people all through history, at least in Europe. It keeps popping up once in a while, and the interpretations varied. But yeah, George Bernard Shaw wrote the famous Pygmalion play that was based on the same story, except he modernized it, and he called it it was called Pygmalion, but in the film version is called My Fair Lady, and everybody knows that one. And in his play, it wasn't a statue; it's actually a woman who's of lower classes. She sells flowers on the street. And there's this learned linguist, like a nobleman, like somebody from the upper classes, who becomes interested in her and creates her, or he tries to transform her into a society lady, and he succeeds. So that was George Bernard Shaw's take on it. But I wanted to go back to the original because Ovid was a remarkable poet, and his poem is so full of images that it really spoke to me in visual terms. But the core of the story, it's quite disturbing, actually. I mean, to fall in love with a woman, a partner that you've created yourself, that's like it's a strange thing. Like, first of all, to fall in love with an image rather than an actual person is something that you really question, and to fall in love with an object as well. So I thought it really spoke to, first of all, object culture, because we're so surrounded by objects, and we invest so much identity and so much psychological content in objects. You know, we personalize cars, our clothing, the objects with which we surround ourselves in our homes, like even ordinary objects, we invest psychological stuff into them. At the same time, now in our time, we're so immersed in artificiality. Social media, you can be friends with people you've never ever met in your life, and you only get to see how they present the kind of identity that they create for themselves online. So I exist online too, but of course I'm not the same as my real identity. It's not the same as my real identity. I pick and choose, and I select, like everybody else does. You show certain aspects of your life, only what you want to share. And our world is moving increasingly in that direction. So I felt it was highly relevant today. And then there's some excesses that you find, like in Japan, the hikikomori is the people that it's kind of a syndrome. People that don't really have a social life anymore. They close themselves off from society. They live in little rooms, and their only interaction with the world is through computers, and often through anime characters and sort of fictional, objectified, stylized versions of real people, like or they're not real people anymore. So they're interpretations of what people could be. So I felt it was highly relevant, and that's why I went with it.
It's kind of interesting because when you're preparing for interviews like this, you don't always know what's going to come out of this. And I did get a chance to watch the films, and in hearing you speak, Kris, it's making me think of Andrea's work, and how in many ways, I think Andrea's work is exploring the opposite, right? It's really about what's real. It's about nature. It's about connection. And Sid, who is the main, for lack of a better term, character in the documentary, the Trapline, is the complete opposite, I think, in many ways to what Kris has just described. This is someone who's really steeped in reality and steeped in connection, oftentimes with the animals. Andrea, do you want to talk a little bit more about the Trapline, and maybe if I could ask you maybe to sort of just talk about how you see Sid and the work that Sid does, and even your work as a filmmaker, how it's dealing with not investing in the artificial and investing in the real.
Yeah, for sure. I think I definitely aim to tell stories that do not involve any sort of tech. We need so much tech to capture the story, of course, but I refuse to like ideally have people on their phones or do it or promote any sort of behavior like that. But Sid's story, Sid is like, she's so determined to live a life that's connected to the land, connected to animals, really work in parallel with and in rhythm with what nature is providing at the time, like the weather and the snowfall and whatever else is happening. And so I think it's a really beautiful example, of it made me really realize how much we've sort of moved away from living in tune with nature. We, especially going into our trap cabin we went in for 2 5-day stints, and the first week we were there was -40 every day. And she's still just going out and doing her thing. It doesn't stop her she just wears more clothing and she's not often defeated by weather, and I think a few of us would be like, oh, it's raining outside, going back in. And especially I see, Kris, you spend a lot of time on the Sunshine Coast. So I think you know what I mean. But it was just a beautiful example of just realizing to spend more time investing in your connection with the land. And, she knows that land more than anyone. And I think it was just a beautiful thing to witness.
That's actually quite interesting, because I felt a similar desire when I made my film. That, I could have gone with, having a character in social media and all that kind of stuff. I wanted to modernize the story, but I left out phones and televisions and all that stuff. And then also I went to a very low tech kind of form of representation. Puppets, they're made from paper. Everything is made from recycled stuff. So it's kind of a way. When I worked in television and video, which I did for most of my life, I really started to miss the direct interaction with audiences, because you spend days and days in front of a computer looking at stuff that happened, weeks ago or months ago, and you're transforming it into something and sending it out into the world, and you often don't even see how people see it, how people watch it. So everything is becoming so remote and so detached that, yeah, I feel drawn to going back to sort of more artisanal, more down to earth, more simple materials, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I did just return from the Banff Film Festival on the weekend, and it was really, really nice to sit in a theater with people and watch some films together and cry together and laugh together. It's a really special experience about that. And I'm excited, that this is all happening in Ottawa. I grew up in Ottawa, and my parents will be at the screening, so that'll be fun. Don't be surprised if my dad stands up and wants to talk. So
I'm sure that will be very welcomed. One of the things that I like about this particular festival is the amount of shorts that they screen, because I think shorts are really interesting. And Andrea, before you joined us, and even before we started recording the interview, Kris and I were talking about the technology that's available to filmmakers and artisans today, and artists today, enables people to have greater freedom, to have more independence. And I just want to ask you both, what has the new technology meant for your craft? How has it changed the way you make film?
Yeah, well, for me, first of all, I made this film at home during the pandemic. I'm a puppeteer now, mostly. I do live shows, but I couldn't do anything during the pandemic. So I thought, well, maybe I can use all my broadcast experience and all that and make a little puppet film. And then you don't really need all that much. You need a computer. I did the whole thing with a DSLR camera and a little smaller camera for a few cutaway shots. But just to be able to do all that. And then I bought some lighting gear that I also use for my puppet shows, that is really meant for DJs. It's sort of not miniaturized, but it's smaller scale than actual theater or film lighting. But you can get all those things now for relatively cheap. And so for virtually no budget, I was able to make a film at home, which is completely different from how it used to be maybe 10 years, 20 years ago. And then on top of that, I use almost exclusively open source software, because I mean, at work, I worked with Adobe Photoshop and Avid and Final Cut, not Final Cut Pro, but After Effects, all these things, all this professional software. And now I've discovered that you can do almost everything with open source software. And by doing that, you become part of this worldwide community of people that create technology for use by everybody around the world. I find it just remarkable. So I've put them in my credits because I felt it's important to spread that idea as well.
I wish I could say the same thing, but I thought we were traveling light when we had like a full skimmer full of camera gear and lights and tripods and light stands, and we had a small crew on this particular set. But I mean, the one thing that is absolutely incredible is like to get some of the scenic visuals that we did. We had just a very small, I would call it prosumer drone. And I mentioned it was -40, so it would like it would take off, and it wasn't quite sure it wanted to get there, and you're like, oh my god, almost hitting you, and then finally it just sort of had the ability to kick in, and I guess you would have captured with a helicopter before, and that budget is outrageous per hour, as most of us know. And so in order, like if you could bring a $2,000 drone out into the backcountry and capture stunning images is pretty incredible. But I would say that what technology has allowed is just for us to be able to shoot in these really harsh conditions and come back with some beautiful imagery. The camera held up in these conditions, and we didn't know if it was going to happen. We had to tape all the batteries onto our body, or just have them on our body to keep them warm. But beyond that, it was pretty seamless.
And I will say, Andrea, that you captured some pretty iconic scenery. I think when oftentimes people think of Canada, they think of many of the images that you were able to capture in your film. We've got a few moments left, and going back to you, Kris, but again, this is a question for both of you. What do you hope people take away from your films?
I hope it makes them think a bit about the artificiality and the technology that we're all immersed in. I start very much from my own passion about something, and then I hope it'll connect, it'll do something for people too. I like watching films that make me think and that I sort of mull over in my head for quite a while after. I don't like films or plays or books that convey a message that in a way that's closed, that doesn't allow me the room to imagine and think and all that stuff. So that's what I hope it'll do is provide stuff for thought, food for thought.
I think that I really am keen to, I think for two reasons, just showcase a bit more of the Yukon territory, which is so beautiful and vast and wonderful and amazing community up there. And hopefully people will see some of that and want to go up and visit in the winter. And then the other thing is I think we've captured a character who really is so committed to the choice that she's made, and the choice that she's made to I guess, live her life. And there's something so beautiful and real about that. And her final line is really like about, she knows she's going to die doing this, and I think that's something so beautiful about that statement. And I feel the same way about probably both Kris and I do as well, as like be able to create content and share stories. I think it's something that I feel like I'm going to do the same. So yeah, I hope people can see that in this film.
Those are the same themes that run through Leo and Chester as well. People who have chosen a life that's a little off the beaten track, but definitely made a very conscious decision about the kind of life that they want to live.
Definitely. Leo and Chester is exactly that. Somebody that turned away a 3-record deal from Sony Records to farm bison. It's a very odd life choice. And I love these characters that sort of buck what society would tell you would be the right path. And I think there's a beautiful lesson in that for all of us.
Kris and Andrea, thank you so much for joining me here on Luta Contunua. That was filmmakers Kris Fleerackers and Andrea Wing, whose films Idol and the Trapline are playing tonight at the Bytown as part of the Ottawa Canadian Film Festival. Up next is my conversation with festival co-founder and filmmaker Jith Paul. Good morning, Jith, and welcome to Luta Contunua.
Thank you.
Jith, I believe it's the 7th year for the festival?
That's correct. So we actually started in 2015 collaborating with other festivals, but 2017 was the first year we did our own annual festival by ourselves.
And Jith, has the festival accomplished what you hope it would at this point in time?
I think so. We just passed the 100 mark in featured films in total over the 7 years. And we have seen films from all across Canada, and that was another goal. This year, we're really happy that our feature film on the third night is a film where characters speak English and French interchangeably, which is indicative of Canada and also specifically this region of the country where you could just walk down the street and hear 2 different languages.
And what film is that, Jith?
Broken Waters. That's on the Saturday.
And so, Jith, for our listeners that would like to check out the festival this weekend, where can they find more information on how to do that?
Our website is ocanfilmfest.ca, and you can check the site out for the names of the films, information about the directors and which films are playing on which days. The first 2 days, Thursday and Fridays, are short film days, and those are at 7 o'clock in the evening. And the third day, the Saturday, is our feature film at 9 o'clock.
And is it advisable for folks to get their tickets in advance, or can they get them at the door?
You can certainly pick them up at the door, but getting them in advance, you can get a festival pass on Eventbrite through our website, or you can also buy individual day tickets from the Bytown box office online. It'll just streamline getting everyone into the theater quickly so that we can maximize the time for the content and a short Q&A. We have a lot of attending directors, so you'll get to hear from them as well.
Jith, thank you so much for joining me here on Luta Contunua.
Thanks very much.
That was filmmaker and co-founder of the Ottawa Canadian Film Festival, Jith Paul. And before I sign off this morning, I'd like to remind listeners that you can make a donation to the station at ckcufm.com/donate. That's it for this edition of Luta Contunua. I'm Monique, signing off until next week.